Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I see some people grabbing cookies. Don't be shy. There's more back there. Um, my name is Andre Mershon, and I work in the Global Climate Change Office at USAID. I'm one of our adaptation specialists in the office. And since all of our other adaptation specialists were otherwise occupied this afternoon, I have the pleasure of being with you to introduce our speaker. And I think this is actually a good topic for me. I work a lot on rural agrarian issues in Africa. And so the talk we're going to get today is pretty relevant to those issues. I also work a lot on the agency's resilience agenda, specifically in the Sahel. And I think some of the things that Dr. McCusker is going to talk to us about today are relevant to a lot of the adaptation work that we're doing. A little bit on Dr. McCusker and kind of what his background is and what brings him here to be with us today. He's an associate professor of geography at West Virginia University. He spent a lot of time and effort doing research on land use and livelihood systems in sub-Saharan Africa. That's really his background. And he spent some time inside USAID as a AAAS fellow. He worked in our Geo Center, our GIS lab, and does a lot of that work for us. And so has some experience kind of inside some of the work that we've done. And he's also done a lot of field work for us out in Malawi under different mechanisms, including the CCRD contract. And so this talk is going to focus on some of his research for that. I wanted to kind of bring out a couple of points of why I think this research is relevant to a lot of the things that USAID is working on and wants to do and is investing in. I think that will set up specifics of Brent's talk. I think one of the things that Brent is going to talk about is kind of the links between people's social vulnerability and climate vulnerability. The fact that we can't divorce those two things in the environments that we work in. People's economic livelihoods, their social standing, all of those things are linked to their vulnerability to climate, and they're very much intertwined. You have to look at them agenda and to help people permanently kind of get out of poverty and respond to recurrent shocks, which is something we're very interested in. I think one of the other things that it asks us to do is to look a little bit backwards and see how people have responded to shocks in the past. It's very hard to tell how people or predict how people are going to be able to respond to shocks in the future, but by looking in the past and by looking at see how people have used their systems and their social capital, their physical capital to respond to shocks in the past, that can help us get an idea of how people are going to respond in the future. It also gives us an idea of perhaps where those systems are weak and where perhaps we might need to make investments in improving those systems. And that could be a wide range of investments. And then finally, I think one of the things we're going to see is really the power of mapping to visualize problems that are very hard to kind of pick apart sometimes. And one of the beautiful things that GIS allows us to do with multiple layers is look at a lot of different layers together, bring those layers and look at them collectively and really identify areas, hotspots where we need to worry about things, but perhaps also see relationships that we haven't been able to see before. So I'm hoping to get all of those things. So Brent, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming out to learn about a very warm place and a very cold day. I wish I were still in Malawi, actually. It's nice and warm there today. I would like to thank everyone who made this talk possible, both Geology and USAID. I think this topic, not my talk in particular, but this topic is critical. Malawi is a country of 14 million people with, in the south, land parcel sizes of less than a quarter of a hectare, dependent on subsistence maize production. And so we are talking about a country that has very, very steep development needs to begin with. We then introduce climate change scenarios on top of that. We have an even more pressing situation. So I'm really happy to see everyone here and to talk to you about this issue. So what I'm going to report today is just under a year's worth of research that I've been doing for Geology and USAID on the Climate Change Resilient Development Program. And we proposed to them that we would start to explore the possibility of looking backward at people's coping strategies to try to look forward to adaptation and providing more resilient livelihoods in the future. It's a very difficult thing to do, predicting the future. But it is a very important thing, and I think that's what you'll see as I set this up. So I'd like to go through a few points here, and I think we're doing questions at the end, but if you have a pressing question in the middle, I'm more than happy to take it. I lecture at a university, so I'm used to that. So what's the bottom line? What are we talking about here? So we want to promote resilient development. That's our goal. We want people to become more resilient as time goes on. And doing that in the face of climate change requires, I would argue, an understanding of the geography of vulnerability, future climate, and the needs of households. Those three things coming together. That's not easy to do, and we don't always put those together. And so this is our attempt, and it's a first attempt, to put those together to try to inform policymakers. This has very much been not just producing neat widgets from science, or not just producing neat maps that we can make nice color ramps and circulate around, but really to help policymakers and decision makers, both in the United States and in Malawi, understand and sort of get their minds around this issue to help these 14 million people, probably many more by the time these scenarios are unfolded. So what is this about? So sounds very straightforward. We wanted to identify where climate change vulnerable people live. We wanted to say, what is the pre-existing social conditions that lead to vulnerability? We wanted to identify their most likely adaptation strategies. That's the two-part, going backward in time to go forward in time. And we wanted to understand how to best communicate climate change and climate information to them. It's really difficult for us in the United States to imagine that climate information transmission is an issue. We hear about it a great deal in the United States. Very different way. We hear about it a great deal, and it's important to understand that the way that people receive information in Malawi is fundamentally different. And if we're going to help provide resilience and encourage adaptation strategies, the people who we are trying, the targets of our development, need to have information about that. And so that was a very important part of this particular research. And we also wanted to provide a scalable, non-place specific method that could be easily implemented in other countries in USAID missions. It doesn't do us very much good if this only affects Malawi, or it's only appropriate for Malawi. We're very careful about that. We didn't want this to be something that was just a descriptive study that doesn't apply in Zambia or doesn't apply in Ethiopia. And so our emphasis as we were developing this and as we were doing this research was to make sure that this is scalable and non-place specific. So that was an important goal of ours. So what we had to do, what we really needed to do to undertake the study is to generate climate change scenarios. That in itself is a tall challenge. There are all sorts of debates about how to do that, issues with statistical models versus general circulation models that are downscaled. We also needed to determine past coping strategies, which itself is quite complex, in order to then identify the most likely future adaptation strategies, or pathways, I'd like to say pathways, for resilience. So that's what we tried to do. We tried to stick very closely to that. We knew that this was quite a bit of research to undertake in less than a year. So we generated precipitation and temperature scenarios for mid and late century Malawi. That was the first thing we did. It's our immediate first task. And our my climatologist colleagues at the University of Texas in Austin, Carrie Cook and Ned Vizzi, generated those. They're really experts in that field, well regarded in generation of these regional climate models and downscaled models. And then we took those, before we did any field work in Malawi, we took those scenarios and we mapped them to past years where the temperature and the precipitation looked similar. And so what we did is we said, if we find in the past where we have similar conditions, we can then ask households, based on recall, their coping strategies for dealing with either the temperature or the precipitation extreme. And so that was the basis of our household survey. That was the point of what we were doing. So we asked respondents a series of questions on climate recall. What did you do in 1992? Or what did you do in 2002 when you had too much rainfall, or when there was not enough rainfall, or the rainfall didn't come at the correct times, or it washed away? I was in Malawi during the floods, and what the media didn't report at that point in January, just a few weeks ago, was that there was an intense dry spell. The rains had not come by January about January 10th, which is extremely unusual. And then when the rains came, it was a deluge, which you saw the result was massive flooding in southern Malawi. That's a huge problem. And so we'll talk about that in regards to adaptation in a little bit. So where did we work? We wanted to do a cross-sectional analysis. We didn't want to be focused in one region of Malawi, but we also didn't want to be focused on one livelihood system. And that's also important. We didn't just focus on farmers. So we worked in Balaka and Machinga. We did that because it aligned with USAID Malawi's priority districts, but it also gave us a sense of highly vulnerable people in Balaka, high level of vulnerability. We knew that going in. We also worked in Mzuzu and in Katabe in the north, and we did that so we would get that livelihood cross-sectionality. In the south, it's predominantly a maize complex. The north, however, has a much more diverse carbohydrate budget for their nutrition. There's cassava and other crops. And then in Katabe, we went to get the influence of fishing on livelihood systems and future scenarios of change. And so we took four research field trips. This gentleman in the white shirt, Mr. Muhanda, is now working on his PhD with me. As a result of this research, he was awarded our research assistantship. He's working now, I think he'd probably rather be in Malawi because it's so cold in Morgantown. But he went and worked with us to do these community interviews. And this is in Balaka. We did several rounds. We collected data from, in total, 400 households, 200 in Balaka and Machinga, and 200 in Mzuzu and Nkatabe. So we did these community interviews. We asked about adaptation strategies like irrigation. We specifically visited those sorts of interventions. We looked at regreening and reforestation as adaptation. We asked all sorts of questions about agriculture, livelihood systems, non-farm livelihood systems. We did the range of livelihoods there. In the north, which is somewhat different from southern Malawi, we did the same. We asked these questions at community level, but also of households. So we did two different sets of interviews. Northern Malawi is slightly hillier. Some of the conditions are different, and so we asked about that range of activities that people undertake. It's more remote, and so one of the reasons that we decided to work in the north as well as the south is because we wanted to find communities that weren't close to transportation routes, weren't easily accessible, and therefore may have a lack of communication, because we wanted to understand how do we reach the diversity of people in Malawi if we're talking about communicating climate change information. So we went on some fun roads, to say the least. And so those are really interesting. And we can learn a lot from village-level studies, especially if they're done in a transect approach, which is what we did. We went across geographies and livelihood systems. But those can be limiting. And the way that those sorts of micro-studies can be limiting is it's quite hard to generalize in a broader context to say much more about vulnerability than beyond those village borders. And so what we did is we picked up on some work that I had been doing for the Geocenter, USH Geocenter, on livelihood vulnerability analysis. And so I did this initially in the country of Niger with some support from some colleagues at Geocenter. We mapped that and we developed a technique, an analysis technique to explore human livelihood vulnerability. And so rather than just leave these four communities sitting there, I decided to put this in that same context, so did a similar analysis for Malawi. The working definition that we have, which is not an agreed upon definition, but it's the one that we're using, is that vulnerability is essentially the occurrence of a hazard times the risk of that the household has in terms of exposure to the hazard, times their capacity to cope. Do they have the capabilities, the assets to cope to the event? And I know there's some questions about that, and we can always get into those. So what we first did is looked at the distribution of vulnerability. And to do this, I looked at the Malawi Third Integrated Household Survey, which is a large data set, 12,000 households collected in cooperation with the World Bank. World Bank funded this, and the government of Malawi implemented it. Cross-sectional, it is nationally representative, and 12,000 households in a country of the size of Malawi is a really very robust data set. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to give the the context of vulnerability for the country. So we looked at geographic constraints. And we took this data and we modeled this data and said, what can we learn about the distribution of vulnerability where the most vulnerable people live? This shows the distance from the household to the nearest populated center, which gives you an idea and a sense of isolation of the household. In Malawi, before the state investment and the state run of the agricultural sector ended, they had a facility called AdMark, which was where households would get their seeds, their fertilizer, they'd sell their maize back. We looked at the distance there to see, again, where these sort of transactional costs might be affecting households. And in red, you're seeing where there are higher distances. The distance to a road is very important. Transaction costs are very high, and that can be prohibitive to some households. And so what you're seeing there is in red, the households are furthest from a road in the darker red. And so that's sort of your basic constraint, your physical infrastructure constraint, leading to which can lead in some regards to vulnerability. The other thing that we look at when we look at vulnerabilities, we look at environmental shocks. Now, here what we do is we go into this data set, and it's organized in such a way that they ask households, have you experienced this event? And those are grouped into shocks. So this isn't environmental vulnerability assessment, where you take the environmental conditions that could lead to vulnerability and you analyze them to see where the environment could lead to people being vulnerable. This is a complement to that. And what this sort of analysis says is we ask the household if they experienced this shock in the past 7 days, in the past 2 weeks, in the past 2 months, and they report whether or not they experienced the shock. Now, that's household interviews. It is limited, and you'll see in one of my later slides, it's limited to all of those issues, that happen when you interview people. And we're just limited by that, and we can't fix those issues, but we think it gives a better sense of actual household vulnerability. And so I've grouped these into these bigger categories of shock, which is sort of a corollary to vulnerability. So this is a map of the vulnerability of households to drought. This is 2010 to 2011 data. There is new data, there always is, and it always comes out right after you finish the analysis, which is exactly what happened. I think I was in Malawi when they released this. So I'll do some updating. So this is the distribution of vulnerability from low to high. All of the maps are in a standard scale, so I'm not showing you different levels of vulnerability based on the factor. They're all standardized so that you're seeing in relative to each other, it's the same scale. So this is the households reporting that they experienced drought or drought conditions. And so what happens is there's an interview at a household. We then get a cluster point for a cluster of households so that we're not violating human subjects regulations. And so you get these distribution of points. And from that, we do mathematical interpolation. It's a logical, we use logical terms to interpolate to give you a smooth map here. And so the reason that Malawi in this particular year is very good is because there are 12,000 households, which means our interpolation, we're very, very confident that it's showing you a high degree of accuracy. So that's drought. Not high vulnerability to floods. 2010, 2011, we did not have the drought flood issue that we had this year. I've done data set analysis where both droughts and floods show up in the same year and people were sort of confused. That's because the best climatological science we have says that the rainy season is actually getting compressed in southern Africa into January or February. And so you're getting the average annual rainfall. It's just all coming in 1 month. So households can have both, and this survey, if they do the survey this year, the household will have both, they'll report a drought shock, because it didn't rain until January 10th. It usually starts November 10th. And they'll report flood shock, because when it rained, it really rained and it flooded everyone. And so that's why I do both drought and flood, because of that phenomenon in southern Africa. The vulnerability of households to crop pests, those can be a problem. We don't see widespread vulnerability here in 2010, 2011 for Malawi. Livestock disease. You don't see a high vulnerability in the south because we just don't have a lot of livestock in southern Malawi. The population density is far too high. It's very rare. I lived in Malawi, and I just couldn't, I had been living in South Africa, and it just kept striking me that there are no cattle. Where are the cattle? Anybody who's familiar with Southern Africa, you're always looking for the cattle in the livelihood system, but the population density and the land pressure is too high. But in the north, you see some livestock disease that affect people's livelihoods and their vulnerability. The other thing that we can look at is social shocks. These are selected. You notice I'm not picking them just because I'm showing you massive vulnerability. There's a range. Different factors contribute to vulnerability at different times. Theft is often a big issue. Households report that their implements were stolen, their goats or chickens were stolen, their houses were burglarized. We don't see that, at least in this year. Illness is another key concern, and you do see some moderate levels of vulnerability in the South. And conflict or violence. And I just did this because I was interested in the role of conflict and violence. We hear a lot about it in our micro household interviews, but it doesn't show up in national level statistics. And I think that also shows the value of this sort of approach, which is mixed methods. We're not just relying on national surveys. We do have detailed household data, either quantitative and or qualitative, that point to these issues that don't show up elsewhere. And so these methods complement each other. One of the livelihoods literature points to this as well. One of the greatest areas of vulnerability is to financial shocks or food price, input price, cell shocks. Households are very, very vulnerable to this in Malawi. This is the distribution. Again, darker red means higher vulnerability. Households who are vulnerable to high input prices, fertilizer costs too much for the household. Even with the coupon plan that Malawi has, fertilizer costs too much. It's generally fertilizer driving this level of vulnerability. They cannot afford to have the inputs to their agriculture. You know what that's going to do to their output, which is going to affect their household vulnerability. Low crop prices. I always hear villagers complaining that when they take their maize to sell, they're not getting the price that they want. It's common in rural Malawi to hear that. And so in central Malawi, this is north of Salima, in central Malawi, we see a massive problem with low crop prices. And food price shocks. Food price shocks, interestingly, have these clusters. In Chikwawa in the south, Chikwawa is a highly vulnerable zone. We know that. This reifies that understanding. Salima, and then in the far north, these households are particularly vulnerable to food prices going too high, so high that the household cannot purchase food. So if we add this together, that's what we're looking at. We're trying to get a general sense, and this is it's a snapshot. This is not all vulnerability for Malawi all the time. I'll be very interested myself to see where these bands move when we process the 2013, 2014 data. But in 2010, 2011, which was not a particularly good year or a particularly bad year, we also look for that. We don't want to overemphasize shocks or underemphasize them. This is the distribution of vulnerability to all shocks across the data set, across the households that we mapped. And in blue, households are less vulnerable, meaning that they have fewer across the board exposure to shocks. And in red areas, 2010, 2011, they had higher exposure. Now, what we would ostensibly want to do is add up the different years and get a general sense of vulnerability. And then we'd like to compare that to what we think might happen in the future. So again, just to point out, these are all shocks. There's a cluster in Chikwawa and Salima, and a small cluster here in the north around Nkata Bay. Sure.
We did a similar exercise with Molly last year, about a year and a half ago. We found actually around major population centers, we found a lot less vulnerability in rural areas. We also found vulnerability closely correlated with rainfall. Did you find any of those two observations in your data here?
Yes, and you can see it here. That's the city of Blantyre with lower vulnerability. That's the city of Lilongwe with lower vulnerability, and that's the city of Mzuzu with lower vulnerability. And primarily the reason that happens is because there are more diverse livelihoods around the urban areas. They're not so dependent on agriculture, which is why you're picking up the rainfall issue. Exactly. Yeah. So, if we know where their current vulnerabilities are, and that's just one time slice, we can begin to ask the question, or we can pose the question, where might we see the most acute problems under various climate change scenarios? So we did 2 scenario maps. We looked at precipitation and temperature in 2050 and 2100. I haven't shown 2100 because I think that's far out in the future. When I'll show you here in just a second. I didn't look as much with the intersection of vulnerability and 2100. I'll show it to you, but that's just too far out, I think, for social and economic variables to hold any weight. However, when we think ahead and we think of long-term development programming, it's critical to have that information. So this is the mid-century precipitation change scenario for Malawi. It's a scenario, it's not a prediction. It's got all of the caveats of climate models behind it. And what you're seeing in red is the daily change in precipitation in millimeters per day, and that's a decline, that's a deficit. It's a reduction in precipitation between now and 2050. And you can see that there is the scenario, the climate scenario for Malawi shows very strong downward pressure on precipitation in the south. In anybody who's familiar with Malawi, and I thank Tim Essam for pointing out that I should point this out, is that this is Malawi's maize belt. And it is highly vulnerable. This is where you have households farming maize for their annual consumption on less than 1/4 of a hectare of land. And we're going to turn down the precipitation per day by about 1 millimeter a day during the rainy season. That is significant. That is not a small impact. By end of 21, late 21, this is essentially in about 80 years or so, this is the distribution of the rain decrease that you'll see. Again, most severe in the darkest red. And you'll notice that that's Malawi's tobacco belt. So the climate change scenarios, in short, are telling us that by mid-century we affect Malawi's food production for its subsistence agriculture, and by the end of the century we affect its crop production for its export earnings. Say that again. By the mid-century we're affecting Malawi's food consumption, and by the end of the century we're affecting the single largest generator of foreign exchange for the country, which is the tobacco auction. There are others. There are other things that generate income, but not at the level of tobacco. That is significant to know, to think about how do we make this country of 14 million people with a very high population growth rate more resilient. We have to know that. And this is what we argue in the GeoCenter, is that map that shows that in correlation with this technology never works, bear with me. A distribution, this is mid-century, of vulnerability. Vulnerability is what I'm swiping under now. There's your vulnerability map. And there's your precipitation change map. And clearly here in the south, notice the overlap in Chikwawa and Cholo and Mulanje. Notice it again in the south. The correlation, or the overlap, I should say, between lower precipitation and, at least for the 2010-2011 identification of vulnerable households. That is significant if we're trying to say where do we need to get to the most vulnerable households first in adaptation planning in Malawi. We know we can, and this is what we argue in the GeoCenter about mapping, is that that gives you a very different picture, and you get a very different sense of needs if you can see that spatially. And that's what this research has also been about. I can't believe the technology worked, almost never does. So at this point, we know where currently vulnerable people live in Malawi. We can do another assessment, we can get a different vulnerability map, we can add them up, we can criticize them, we can interrogate them, we can make the data bleed. We can scream at it and get it to tell us what we want it to tell us. We know that, we can get a sense of that. We also are pretty confident that we've got a general sense of the precipitation and temperature scenarios for Malawi at mid-century. I didn't show you temperature, it's just going to get hotter. Now, what do we do? How might people adapt? This is where the social science and the physical science comes together and tries to predict the future. That always goes well. So we tried a logical approach which is what we called adaptation backcasting. We asked households to tell us how they coped in the past to years that had similar precipitation and temperature profiles to our mid-century scenarios. Here's what they told us. They replant crops, the most common coping strategy. They rely on Ganyu labor, which is informal, small-scale, relative or neighbor exchanges of labor, or they rely on small businesses, which is petty commodity trade, petty commodity production. We're not talking about establishment of formal shops. We're talking about small income-generating activities, largely women. And they said in those years that we had in the past, similar to what we showed, we borrowed extensively from neighbors and relatives. You will notice that none of these are extremely strong coping mechanisms. They are all reliant on others in the community who are more resilient than the household itself. That is a big problem because of the map that I showed of vulnerability, where you see that you have large areas of people who are highly vulnerable. And so these strategies are very risky. We then ask them if these would be viable strategies in the future. Any of you who've done research at the household scale in sub-Saharan Africa know that asking questions about the future is, forget it. It's really very difficult because the number one answer is it's in God's hands. It's the number one answer across the board. So I had done some previous research, NSF research, about how we asked that question about the future. And this is where that research led us to the idea of adaptation backcasting. So we build this knowledge incrementally. And so we took some of that information about how we ask questions about the future, and we devised a series of questions to say, if this changes, what would happen? We know that there are a couple of interloping factors in future decision-making, most notably price fluctuations and currency exchange rates. That's a huge factor in Malawi. It kills rural households when the kwacha gets devalued. And so we know what those factors are. We identified them previously, and so we talked through. This is why qualitative research is also very important, because you can explain to a household what it is you're interested in, and you can talk to them for a long period of time, over a couple hours, to get to this information. And they told us it's getting harder and harder to find enough land to grow crops, especially in the South. We're at a land frontier. We don't have any more land to start opening up. People only grow maize in the South, predominantly. There is a great deal of cultural resistance to switching to more drought-resistant crops like cassava. Cassava can be a wonderful crop in terms of promoting both dietary diversity and adaptation because you store it in the ground. It can be harvested at a variety of times. However, there are problems. There are a lot of cassava diseases. We visited places in the north with massive, where cassava couldn't be grown because of the disease. But they told us, and they'll need more access to fertilizers and credit. That was a big response in the future. So we need more diverse crops. We need to get people off of just growing maize. We need to find more land, and we need to have more access to fertilizers and credit. And that last point about credit was something that we hadn't considered. We hadn't thought of that in terms of an adaptation strategy. But households said time and time again to us, having access to that small amount of credit and microcredit helps us dramatically to weather some of these climate changes. And so, we know the whole literature on microloans and that the poorest of the poor don't actually benefit from those. We think that that's also a spatial issue. We'd like to do research on that and say we think there's some issues of geography there as well. But especially women, this is very interesting. We did everything here is gendered. We set that up from the beginning. The survey is gendered, qualitative surveys are gendered, and we just aren't presenting it today. When prompted in these qualitative interviews, respondents were overwhelmingly positive about the role that village savings and loans, that's what they're called in Malawi, they're overwhelmingly positive about the role that those institutions have to help them adapt to changing weather and agriculture conditions. They say the same thing, not surprisingly, that the literature on this topic says, which is, we know it's not getting the poorest of the poor. We asked about that, and they said, we just don't have any money to save. And you can take that, we can argue about that later. But one of the bigger adaptation and coping strategy and future issues that we really have to confront in Malawi is the issue of maize dependency. It is critical. There are too many people too dependent on small plots of land to produce all of the maize that they need for their household for the year. That is a big problem. Cassava could be a viable alternative in the north, faces that cultural resistance in the south. There are pest issues. But clearly, the maize complex is making southern Malawians extremely vulnerable. And so the last thing that we wanted to know is the best way of communicating climate information to smallholder farmers. It was unreal to me when I first started working in Malawi, and it's unreal to me when I asked this question, just how poorly information spreads in rural villages still to this day in Malawi. People do not have smartphones. They don't want to pay for SMS. Their phones work once a month when they get some cash, and they don't receive the SMS information in between. It's very difficult, this communication. The state infrastructure that Kumuzubanda put in place during his rule has disintegrated. There was a strong network in agriculture to disseminate information. It's largely not there. And so they said, the best way to communicate with us is by the radio. This is funny, because I have this on video. It says, the best way to communicate with us is on the radio. Great, but I don't have a radio. So how are you going to get a radio? The government should give us a radio. It's fascinating. Said, well, could we use your SMS? Yes, SMS would work. Give me a phone. Agricultural extension agents. The collapse of the state extension system has affected households. They said, we were meeting in an old AdMark facility in the north. They said, no one comes to visit us. You know, back in those days, we'd had all of this extension. The officers were always around. We could ask them questions. And now we barely see the extension agent. He complains because he has no petrol for his motorcycle. His motorcycle broke down. He never comes to see us. We could use those agricultural extension agents. And then afterwards, we talk about other forms of communication, things like farmers' clubs. It's kind of fascinating because we asked them, why don't you form a farmers' club? They said, well, nobody's here to force us to form a farmers' club. And so we see in some of these strains, there is also a bit of a dependency that kicks in where people aren't organically forming farmers' clubs. They're waiting for some sort of stimulus to do that in many cases. In other cases, not. But we did hear that several times we asked that question. And similarly, we want to know what's the best way to communicate these results, these complex results, to decision makers in both the United States and Malawi. So we experimented with some of this. This is, again, technology. Please forgive me when it crashes. So this is what I'm teaching a course in African geography, and I want to go into Malawi and show students the landscape. We do these sort of neat 3D visualizations, and we can show them the Rift Valley floor. So the Rift Valley floor there. This is great for physical modeling, flood modeling, biophysical. They love this sort of stuff because you can get a much better sense of the landscape and some of the conditions. What we haven't done, and sorry, this is very touchy there. What we haven't done is to do any sort of decision making with social science, social vulnerability, whatever sort of data we have. It's just not something that has been done very much. And so what we're starting to do is experiment with this and say, what is the best way to communicate the impact of some of these issues? Is it something like this? That's that vulnerability map that I showed you. Ignore anything outside of the borders. It's affected by the mathematical modeling. I couldn't get it to, but inside the borders of Malawi, you can see the surface of vulnerability. Now, okay, great. I have a 3D animation I can show you, but it gets people's attention. It gets them to think about the different dimensions. I can show you crop sales. Those are households in this survey that reported their crop sales. So that higher peak is more income from crops. I'll turn this off. So that's the distribution of households that make some sort of income from crops. I was doing some previous analysis, and that's in green, the distribution of households making income from the sale of forest products. That's very interesting for the global climate change team, for instance, at USAID to see, because there's a correlation between the promotion of tobacco production in the central region here, and sale of forest products to those households for energy to dry tobacco. So what would be a clear development success story, having smallholder incomes rise as a result of taking the tobacco sector away from the state in 1994. Kuzibanda was resigned. The donors opened up the smallholder sector to tobacco production and absolutely had an effect. No question. It's there because those households in the central region saw their incomes go up. There they are. But they also had a higher demand for wood products. And so that development success story has a follow-on effect in something we're trying to understand in terms of climate change. That's what we're trying to do with this intersection of vulnerability and climate change scenarios. What are those unknowns? What are those factors that we may not be thinking about from the intersection of these two types of data sets where we may not exactly predict that? I searched high and low for anyone at that time who said in any meeting, I finally found him in a completely different context, Walter Knausenberger in the Africa Bureau at AID, to say this is going to have an impact on the environment. But by and large, that wasn't a huge consideration. The concern was to raise household incomes. That worked. So what happens when we look at this vulnerability surface? And this is better for communicating the intensity, I think, decision makers can tell us, the intensity of vulnerability. Again, that's household data that has been interpolated mathematically and then just projected in 3 dimensions. And we can walk through that and we can see where those intersections. That's sort of the experimental part of this research that we're working through to say what is the best way, not only for households, but for our decision makers to make these decisions. So just to summarize, the research combined an assessment of present vulnerability with future climate scenarios, household interviews, to determine the most likely climate change adaptation strategies of households and then to translate those into a broader picture. We developed this reproducible method that's scalable, generalizable, and place independent. So you could functionally do this in any country that you're interested in. There are some limitations in terms of having robust enough household level data. So if you wanted to do this in any of those countries, there are data sets, there are climate change scenarios, go. You're now empowered to go and make lots of analyses about the impact of climate change on existing and future household livelihood systems and general societal well-being. So I've presented a lot of information, and I'm willing to take as many questions as time allows. Just introduce yourself, please. Sorry.